At 6:32 by my count. The last thing that I want to do is keep people from the Pats game, so we might as well get going. Um, so first things first, welcome everybody. Good evening. My name is Russ Becker. Very quickly, because I think we're all still working through Zoom here. Can everyone hear me and see me okay? Good enough. Excellent. I realize that I can't see all of you, so if you can't, then sorry, but hopefully you are nodding emphatically. I am the school adjustment counselor here at both Blake Middle School and Medfield High School. I want to first just sort of thank all of you for being here and for being willing to be a part of this conversation, especially on a cold night with a topic that we all sort of deem to be very, very important. So I just appreciate everybody's attendance here tonight. Before we begin, I sort of wanted to give a quick history about some of the work that we've been doing as a district over the past handful of years and sort of how we ended up here to leap off into the presentation tonight. If I'm not mistaken, this will be about the 8th year that we've done some sort of programmatic suicide prevention within Medfield. 8 years doesn't sound like a whole lot, but if you sort of compare our timeline to other districts, we've kind of been at this for a good while. For many years, however, at least the first 2 or 3, we were doing the work primarily at the high school with both the freshman and senior class. As time went on, however, as we continued to do this work, we realized that it was unbelievably important that we start this work sooner to give a foundational knowledge base to our students so that we could help sooner, so that they could utilize these skills to both help themselves and then help other students should this ever become a pertinent piece of their experience within our building. We sort of then tailored the program, I believe this was 3 or 4 years ago, where we were giving our own presentation. We had sort of built it from scratch. We took bits and pieces from other programs, and we were delivering this information to our 7th grade students. In recent years, however, we had the opportunity to partner and work with Samaritans, which is the Massachusetts Suicide Helpline. And they have been not just an incredible resource to us as a school, but to us as a community at large. So with that said, we have Kelsey Manders here on the panel, who is from Samaritans, who will be sharing information with you in a second. So our goal tonight is to give you a bit of information so that you can use, or you can sort of have your own foundational knowledge base, but also to sort of give you a little bit of a feel for what the presentations are going to be like for the 7th graders next week. My assumption is you will probably have questions, you might have some curiosities. We'll have plenty of time and plenty of availability for you to ask and answer those questions as well. But for now, Kelsey, please take it away.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So yes, my name is Kelsey. I'm here with an organization called Samaritans. My guess is, some of you have probably heard of us, maybe others are not quite as familiar. So I'll talk a little bit about what we do and what we'll be doing with the students as we move forward. But I want to preface this all by saying, you're the experts in your kid's life. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the best practices that we use in the field. But I always like to remind parents, individuals, we're not stepping on any toes. If we share something that feels kind of separate, contrary to what you use as a family, as a parent, then of course, please move forward with what you feel most comfortable with. But as I mentioned, I'm here with Samaritans. The main thing to know if you don't know much about us is that we aim to prevent suicide and to support people who have lost a loved one to suicide. So we do that really with 3 different prongs of services. The prevention piece is my team. It's what you're seeing right now. Really, we go all over Massachusetts. Of course, right now it's virtually, to organizations, schools, corporations, really anywhere that's willing to start that conversation about suicide prevention. We're there, we're having that with them, and we're starting that conversation. The postvention piece on the right there are grief support services. So right now, all virtual as well. We have one-on-one meetings and support groups for people who have lost a loved one to suicide. It's specific to suicide because we know that the way that grief plays out with a loss by suicide, it tends to look a little bit different than other grief. But the middle piece there, the intervention piece, I think is what most people probably really know us for. And what that really comes down to, and as Russ mentioned, it's our 24/7 helpline. So it's a resource that you can call your student, or your child can call or text 24/7. So I'll share that number at the end. We share that with the students as well. We talk a little bit about what they can expect if they call or text the helpline, kind of to demystify that process. So on that helpline, we get about 80,000 calls and texts on an average year. So if you do the math, I believe it's about like 200, give or take, on any given day. So you can probably imagine that with that many calls, that many texts, every day we're talking to people who have thoughts of suicide, which is absolutely true. But, every day we're also talking to people who, it's a young person and they have a big test the next morning and it's 3 a.m. They're really anxious. They just can't sleep. They need someone to talk to. Or they got in a fight with their friends and they need a listening ear. So, I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize about our helpline is you don't have to have thoughts of suicide to call us and to use us as a resource. Of course, as I said, every day we're talking to people who do, but it's also really for anything that's hard, stressful, that person just needs a listening ear for. The other important things to know is it's a free service, so there's no charge associated with it, and it's confidential and anonymous. So I always like to remind everyone that the caveat there is very similar to what it would look like for teachers and guidance counselors at the school, is that we keep that confidentiality unless we believe that that person is going to harm themselves or others. But for the most part, we want to keep it confidential. We want to let them talk about what they're going through. If you have any questions about the helpline specifically, feel free to drop those in the chat box, and I'm happy to address them. Sometimes that's the biggest part of the program, is kind of demystifying that for children and talking a little bit about what that looks like. So the real thing that we're here to talk about today is suicide prevention for young people and why are we doing it, right? So what we know right now is that suicide is the second leading cause of death for young people ages 10 to 24. And really about 17.7%, or if your mind works better in fractions, it's about 1/6 of high school students. So 1 out of every 6 high school students report having thoughts of suicide. And what we're seeing is that's really trickling down to other age levels as well. So what we're trying to do is just start these conversations that a lot of people don't know how to begin, don't know how to talk through. So we start these conversations, create more of an open environment with those young people, and hopefully provide them with those tools and those resources that they can do to support themselves and their friends. So I have a few true or false questions. I can't see the chat box, so I guess I'm just going to ask you to kind of think about it in your head. I'll put it up on the screen, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about what the answer is and why that is. So the first is true or false. Talking about suicide will cause someone to consider suicide. So we mark this as false, but I want to say that it's still kind of a myth or a stigma that we're trying to break down in the field. It can be quite common to still have these thoughts. And, I think it's an understandable fear, right? We're worried that what if we're supporting someone we love and we say the wrong thing, right? We say something that makes the situation worse. But what I can tell you as a professional in the suicide prevention field is that actually, if someone's having those thoughts of suicide and we ask them pretty directly about it, it can be one of the best things we can do for them. Often when people are having those thoughts of suicide, they're also feeling like a burden. And so it can be really hard for them to start the conversation. So by us asking directly, really what we're doing is we're opening the door. And then all that person has to do is kind of take that step forward towards the help that they might need. And, if someone's not feeling this way, we can't just magically pop that thought into their head. So I understand that it's a fear. And, I always say to young people, I don't expect all of you to walk out today and feel 100% comfortable to ask someone that question. What I do hope is that people walk away knowing that it's okay to ask about suicide, and honestly can be one of the most helpful things. Sometimes people will bring up, what about if someone's encouraging it? When we talk about talking about suicide, of course, we're talking about it in a compassionate way, in a goal-oriented way, in a way that we want to help that person get better. And if that's the case, again, it really is one of the most helpful things. So the next question, or true or false statement, is true or false. People who are suicidal usually warn those around them. This one's a little bit more complicated. I don't like to dwell too far on it, but I do think it's important to talk a little bit about. And we mark this as true, but I always kind of like to say that it's true and it's false. So what we know by research is that about 70% of the time when someone attempts suicide, there are some warning signs there. So that does mean 30% of the time, or almost 1/3 of the time, there's going to be times when family and friends are blindsided. And, I want to pay respect to that because that's a really hard thing to grieve and to work through. But 70% of the time, there are some warning signs. They tend to be subtle. It's not often that people directly say, I'm having thoughts of suicide. It happens, and sometimes it happens more often when we can prompt that question to them. But a lot of the times we get kind of behavioral changes, physical changes that we'll talk a little bit more about. So, what I always say to young people again is that if we know that we're getting warning signs sometimes, maybe sometimes there's going to be times when we're blindsided, I think the best we can do is get to know some of those risk factors, those warning signs of the people around us, their own individual ways of telling us they're struggling, and be ready with the tools and resources to support them. But, also give ourselves a little bit of grace. This is a hard subject, and there definitely are times when people really do feel at a loss. This one, the true or false, suicide is caused by one isolated event or factor. Again, this is false as well. So it's a narrative we hear a lot, that one thing caused a suicide, but I always like to remind people, think about your own bad day. Whenever you're having a tough day, there's probably more than one thing that's stressing you out. And it's the same for someone who's having thoughts of suicide. So we hear this narrative quite a lot, but it's something that we really want to take some time and think about how one event or factor cannot be blamed for suicide. So what I have on the screen here is just some risk factors that we see within youth in the suicide prevention field. It's not an exhaustive list. There may be things that you're noticing from your young people that you're seeing that's not up on the screen here. But these are ones that we see quite often within the field. So same thing that we talk to with young people, we always go over risk factors and warning signs with them. I always remind them that, all of us have maybe some of these, and maybe they kind of wax and wane throughout our life. There are times when there's more, times when there's less. So it's not that having any of these risk factors means that someone's automatically going to have those thoughts of suicide. But the more a person has of these, it starts to get a little bit kind of out of control, a little bit too hard to handle. So we work with students to talk about, if you have a lot of these risk factors, if you feel like there's a lot of really challenging things that you're going through, who is your trusted adult? Who's your support system to reach out to? And we also talk to them about checking in with a friend. So if a friend is having a lot of these challenges, if they're noticing something is off with their friend, how do we check in with them, and how do we support them and connect them with a trusted adult? So the other thing we work on them with is warning signs. And we talk a little bit about what those might look like. And we have kind of 3 categories of what that might fall into. So we have verbal warning signs, physical warning signs, and behavioral warning signs. Those verbal warning signs, as I mentioned, aren't super common. They happen, but they tend to be usually a bit more indirect of statements. So people will say something like, I'm tired of being a burden. I wish this was all over. No one would miss me if I were gone. We hear it in more kind of indirect ways, statements that sometimes can be easy to overlook. So the best thing we can do with verbal warning signs is just start to tune our ears to them and take them with the gravity of it that they hold. Follow up with our child and ask what they mean by that, kind of explore it a little bit more. The physical warning signs, as you can imagine, it's just anything that changes in a physical appearance, right? Something that is a change from that person's typical behavior, typical physical features. The behavioral ones is the biggest category. It's the ones that we tend to see probably the most often, and again, also tend to be a little bit more subtle. So it's things like seeing declining school performance, not being interested in any of their hobbies, not finding anything enjoyable, or withdrawing from friends, family, or society. So in the youth workshops, we talk about warning signs. We ask students a little bit about how they can tell when their friends are struggling, and then what the next steps are if we do notice them. So before I go into kind of the tools that we start to give the students, I want to take a moment and just say that, this is a heavy topic. And I want to thank you all for taking your time today to come and talk about this. And I always want to remind people that there's also a lot of resilience and hope within humans. And, we talk a lot about those risk factors, we talk about those warning signs, and sometimes it can feel like I cast kind of a dark storm cloud over the room. But I really do believe that humans are built to take care of themselves, to keep themselves safe. And for whatever reason, sometimes that's chipped away at for who knows what reason. But what we know is if we can work with our young people, if we can work with them on kind of their risk mitigating factors, things that they enjoy, and if we can find any form of connection that is important to them, it actually makes the outcomes more positive. And connections can look like anything. We can get kind of creative with that. It can be connections within our family, connections within their social support, or a book or a movie that makes them feel understood. So we like to talk about working with young people about these, working on their self-care when they're not necessarily in that crisis moment. So we spend a portion of the workshop as well talking about self-care with those students, kind of having them develop their own self-care plan so they can put that into place whenever they're struggling. But a main part of the conversation that we talk to them about is we talk about after you've seen those risk factors or warning signs, if your friend is exhibiting those, what do you do? What are the tools that you can use to support them? And really, we break it down into 3 simple steps. So we talk about listening skills, active listening skills, kind of what type of questions they can ask, and then what the process of getting help looks like. So I'll go over these kind of briefly and talk a little bit about also how you all can use some of these to talk to your young people. But if you have any questions, if anything isn't kind of clear, or if you want to know the difference of what I'm showing to you right now or how we talk to it about students, please again put that in the chat box and I'm happy to answer those. So with the students, we talk about kind of what does good listening look like, right? All of us probably learned that like way back in grade school. But it can be really easy, I think, even for adults to be listening to someone and doing something at the same time and be distracted. So we want to talk really with the students about what is active listening. So we talk about putting away distractions, being non-judgmental, having open body language, and then we talk a lot about validating statements. So validating what their friend is going through, letting them know that it's okay to have those feelings, to be struggling with whatever seems pretty challenging in their life right now. The big don'ts that we always talk to students about listening is we don't really want to talk about ourselves and we don't really want to give advice or try to solve problems. And that's the same for, myself as an adult when I work with young people. I don't talk about myself. I don't tend to give advice or try to solve their problems. So I think the one that is kind of sometimes a gray area is the give advice area. So, I think at Samaritans, we don't think advice is 100% good, 100% bad, but I think that as humans, we jump to giving advice to trying to solve the problem before we really give that person the space to just talk about what they're going through. And, we talk a little bit about what could be the negative side of giving advice. And often we hear answers like, I might give the wrong advice. I don't know how to handle this as a young person. So I don't want to give them advice. I'd rather connect them to someone else, to an adult in their life. And what I always remind people is I always like to ask someone before I give them advice. Just saying, simply, I've had a few people in my life who have went through a similar problem and I know what helps them. I want to know if you would like to hear that advice. And then we kind of give that power to that person. If they want to hear that advice, then we can start problem solving, we can start talking about it. But if they don't want that advice at the moment, I'm going to try to respect that and give them the space. So we talk to students a little bit about how we can avoid giving advice and what that might look like. Then the next part we work with on them is asking open-ended questions. So on our helpline, this is very similar. We tend to avoid closed-ended questions. So questions that people can just say yes or no to, because we want to give them the space to really explore what they're going through. So really open-ended questions, we have students provide a few examples. We talk a little bit about what that means to be open-ended. And we talk a little bit about avoiding why questions. So we don't go too much into depth of the why questions. That tends to be a little bit more with adults, but we do talk a little bit about how sometimes when we ask why questions, people can feel like we're putting them on the spot. So most of our questions are open-ended. They start with what and how. And then the other big thing that we talk about a little bit with young people, but I think that's important to know as adults in their life, is when we ask questions, we try not to avoid the painful things that they're talking about. So we actually steer into that pain as kind of the unofficial motto, I would say, of Samaritans. And what I mean by that is, if a young person comes to me about something that they're struggling with, it can be kind of almost an innate human reaction to try to change the subject, to try to kind of get their mind on something else. But chances are, if they came to me with that painful thing that they're going through, that heavy thing they're going through, they really needed that space to talk about it. So what we do by allowing them that space is we're saying, I see you in this really dark spot right now, but I'm not scared of that. And I'm willing to sit there with you as you're going through this. We also talk a little bit about, we give them some ideas for how we can validate our friends, how we can empathize with them, what questions we can ask them, but that these are all tools to start building in as we feel more comfortable. A lot goes a long way with being compassionate, being sincere, and being there for that friend. So then the next thing we work on after we kind of talk about those skills is we talk about how do you ask someone directly about suicide. So we talk about that myth that we talked about before, that asking directly about suicide will put that thought in someone's head. And then we give them some examples of how they can ask that question. So I personally prefer the two on the left-hand side of the screen here. The one on the right-hand side of the screen is still one that is sometimes used in the field, but there's a little bit of kind of, I think, back and forth of whether that's direct enough or whether that really gets to the point of suicide. But we work with the students to tell them that if they're starting to get worried about a friend, if they're seeing those warning signs, or their friend starts saying something concerning to them, what they want to do is ask them directly, are you having thoughts of suicide? And that's the one exception to the close-ended questions. So that one we want, or open-ended, excuse me, that one we want to be close-ended because then we kind of know what to do next. So we talk to them a little bit about it. We validate the fact that they might be feeling a little nervous. They might be feeling scared or uncomfortable if they have to ask that question. And we talk to them about if they're that support person. So if it's not them who's having those thoughts of suicide, if it's their friend, not only do they want to reach out to a trusted adult for their friend, but they want to reach out to a trusted adult themselves so they can kind of debrief and talk about that experience of supporting a friend, because that can be kind of difficult as well. So really, with the difference between how we do kind of workshops with adults and how we do them with students is that getting help process, we talk really about the adults in their life, that even if their friend says, I'm telling you because you're my friend and you can't tell anyone else, that's way too big of a secret to be keeping to themselves. That's too big of something to put on one person's shoulders. I always like to remind them that I'm an adult in the suicide prevention field, and if I was supporting someone who said they were having thoughts of suicide, I wouldn't be working by myself either. I'd be working with a supervisor. I'd be debriefing and making sure that this person has a network around them. And so, of course, if I, as an adult, am needing that extra support around there, as a young person, they definitely should be reaching out to those adults. So then we also work with them to kind of identify who those might be in their life. I like to have kind of students share, we share them anonymously of who they might reach out to get kind of an idea that there are quite a few different types of trusted adults that they can reach out to. I mean, you as parents, they can reach out to. We have a ton right here from Blake in the room that they can reach out to and really let them know that there are adults out there who want to support them and want to listen to them. I do want to talk just kind of briefly about what you all can do if you are supporting someone, if your young person ever comes to you with these thoughts, because I think that, that's probably also part of the fear is, what if this brings up something? What if they come and talk to me after? We don't go into this with young people. We don't go into kind of what the next steps are for getting a person help, because we don't want to put that in their laps, right? That's why they're going to that trusted adult who has went through training, who knows how to do risk assessments, all those other things. But I want to just briefly talk to you all, if you ever have to ask that question, kind of what the next steps might look like. So the big thing is, after we ask, are you having thoughts of suicide? If someone says no, as much as possible as adults, we just try not to express any relief. I try not to say anything like, oh, I'm glad you're not having thoughts of suicide. And that's kind of for multiple reasons. So one, they might not be telling me the truth right now. Maybe they don't feel comfortable telling me the truth for whatever reason. Or maybe right now they're not, but a year from now, 3 years from now, they start having those thoughts. And when I express relief, what I could be unintentionally saying is, I wasn't really ready to help you if the answer was yes, or I really didn't want the answer to be yes. I think it's okay if you're feeling some of that relief. I think that's a pretty human reaction. But we want to just kind of hold that in for the time being and take care of ourselves after, talk about that afterwards if we need to. And so sometimes people ask me, what do I say then? What do I say if someone says no to me? And, most of the things I talk to people about in these conversations are not the same. I ask different questions. I use different validations tailored to what they're talking to me about. But this is the one thing that honestly, I tend to say the same response every single time. And that's if someone says no to me, I usually just say, thanks for sharing that with me. And then I follow up with a question about what they're going through, give them a little bit more space to talk because they still need my support. If the person says yes, so if you're supporting a young person, if they say, yeah, I'm having those thoughts of suicide, I think the two most important things to know is that you're not immediately on a timer. It can really feel like that. I can, say that when I would be on the helpline when I first started, it would feel like that. It felt like I had to go through all my next questions, make sure I got all the information and got them connected to support. But if your young person is talking to you, if your child is talking to you, if they're saying yes and they're engaged in this conversation, they're at least a little bit safer than you might innately think they are because they're actively reaching out for that support, for that help. So it's important to try to stay calm, take a deep breath and figure out kind of the next steps. What we do on the Samaritans helpline then is we ask some follow-up risk assessment questions. We ask if they have a plan, means, and timeframes to kind of decide where they are on the scale of risk there. And then getting help really depends on where they are on the risk assessment. If it's lower risk, if someone is saying, I'm having thoughts of suicide, but I've never really thought about a plan. I don't have a time. Really, that's more of what we call passive ideation. And that would look more like working with counselors at the school, working with the guidance department, with their teachers to create that support system and make sure that they have that in place. Of course, if the risk level is higher, so if the person, as I mentioned before, is planning to harm themselves or someone else, on our helpline, that's when we'd be reaching out to those emergency services, and that's when we would be breaking that confidentiality. But you can also remind your child, if they ever come to you with these thoughts of suicide, or if are just struggling in general, that our helpline is one that they can call or text 24/7. So we have a bunch of amazing volunteers who go through extensive training, who are really wonderful at staffing that helpline and who often have been there themselves or have supported someone themselves in the same way and really have those skills to be able to help those around them. So I'm going to skip this for just a moment. I'll skip that as well. I think if you want, I'll send out these slides, but just for time reasons, I'm going to skip over this. I'll send out the slides and you can look through the ones that I'm kind of passing through at the moment. But as I mentioned before, I think the important thing that we talk to young people about and adults alike is that you want to give yourself permission to be human, right? So even though if your young person comes to you with these thoughts, even though you're their parent, you don't have to be the expert and have all the answers, right? That's what people at Samaritans are for. That's what our helpline is for. There's a lot of people within the community who want to support you and your child. So I always like to remind people to be mindful of your limitations, know when to reach out and when you need to get that extra support for a young person. Again, what I have here are just kind of some ideas of how we can interact with youth. But again, I always like to preface this by saying, you know, I'm not a parent, you really are the experts in that. These are just some of the kind of best practices that we tend to use in the mental health field. So again, we encourage our youth to identify trusted adults. That's a big part of the program. We make sure that we're talking pretty openly about mental health and help seeking, that we don't increase stigma around there. We talk about coping skills. So again, during the presentation, they take some time to do their self-care to talk about what can help them. And then lastly, before I definitely want to leave time for questions, because I can imagine that people have a lot, I just want to talk a little bit about really the top two resources on the top here. So again, the Samaritans helpline, that 1877 number, that's the helpline for the state of Massachusetts. And every single call is an English speaking volunteer, but we do have translation services. So that's always nice to know as well. If you do need those translation services, you can call our helpline and get access to those. I always like to remind people though, if you have Spanish as your first language or your preferred language, I would actually go to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We have a contract with them, we work closely with them, but they just have a much bigger kind of bandwidth. And so they're able to have people during every shift who are able to speak English or Spanish to someone, and just kind of cuts out that middleman of that translation services. This is my, I'm a social worker by training, so it almost feels like an obligation to have to say this, but I want to remind you all that, you know, there's probably a lot of nerves around this. Maybe you're not sure what this is going to look like for your young person. And, you know, we're already living in really difficult, heavy times. There's a lot that parents are juggling in their child's life. And so I want to remind you all that I'm sure you're busy. I'm sure there sometimes feels like there's no time in the day to take care of ourselves, but I really encourage you, even if it's 5 minutes, to do some self-care and to model those self-care, those coping skills in front of your children as well, so they start to practice it. One more time, I like to put the helpline number up big on the screen here. You can also, if you ever lose that for whatever reason, you can just Google Samaritans and our website has all of that information. But again, it's one that you can use if you need the support, if you need to kind of figure out how to support a young person in your life. And you can also hand it out to the young people in your life to call or text 24/7. I also want to put my own information up here. You know, I will open it up to questions and I'm happy to answer them that way. But if for any reason you want a little bit more information, there's something I missed, the question popped into your head later, feel free to email me. I'm happy to reach out to you that way as well. Otherwise, I wanted to open it up to any questions because I know I saw one kind of come in, I believe. Oh no, sorry, that was to the true and false. But I want to open it up if anyone has any questions, either about kind of what we do with young people or just in general about suicide prevention.
That's great, Kelsey. I'll jump in as well. So if anybody does have questions, there is just a question and answer feature that's in the chat. So if you want to just put them in there, we'll sort of answer them as they come up. As questions are coming in, Kelsey, one of the things that I know I hear very frequently with this age group and sort of surrounding this presentation, people are curious as to why now. I think a lot of the questions that we hear are, is this too young? Is this a topic that's maybe appropriate for this age group? Can you sort of talk about how this program might be tailored to the 7th grade and why you feel it's so important for this age group?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think most people kind of think about starting to have these conversations in high school, which I think it's important to have them then as well. But what we've kind of learned is that the students need to learn these coping skills and these tools beforehand, so they have them more in their practice. So we don't give them all the tools that I talked to you about today. We don't want to overwhelm them, but we really just talk about being a helpful friend, being a support system. So we kind of tailor it to, it's called How to Help a Friend, because sometimes if we say suicide prevention for young people, they tend to kind of maybe get a little uncomfortable, not sure. So we talk about how to support a friend, but we're also giving them tools on figuring out how to support themselves as well. So it's a little bit more broad. We do talk about asking the question of suicide, but I would say overall, it's kind of a little bit more broadly about supporting their mental health of themselves and their friends. So a little bit more, I would say, that kind of leads into the more age appropriate curriculum that is kind of the best practice within the field.
Great, thank you. So let's see, we have a question here that says, can you read it, Kelsey?
Yes, I can. I'm reading it in just one moment.
So for those who can't see it, reads that my 7th and 8th grader recently witnessed a rescue of a suicide attempt. It was their grandparents' neighbor, a 30-something-year-old woman. They saw her limp body taken from the car, put into a stretcher, and put into an ambulance. Thankfully, the woman's okay. This has been a recent topic at home. I've been saying if you ever feel sad, lonely, or depressed, to talk to this person, their dad, or a trusted adult. Is there anything else that they should be saying or doing?
So that's a really good question. And I think that's, a hard experience for anyone, let alone anyone that age, to go through. It can bring up a lot of different emotions. So I would say what you've been talking to them about, what you've been saying, and by being open and having that conversation, that's incredible. That's already one of the most important things that you can do. This would also honestly be a good use of the helpline. So they could kind of talk about how they felt when they saw that, because sometimes you just need that space for someone to listen to. But I think it's reminding them that your door is always open. Right? Sometimes they're not comfortable quite yet having those conversations, but there's never a time when that door is closed. It's always open. They can come back whenever they start to feel comfortable about that. But I think it's important to talk about it, to not avoid the situation, even though it was a hard one. It was a heavy one, right? Another question came in, says, during this time of COVID, do you have helpful conversation topics that can address anxiety so that they do not lead to suicidal thoughts? That's a good question. I think right now everyone's kind of having probably a ramp, or not everyone, but a lot of people are having kind of ramped up anxiety and are struggling with a lot. So I don't have the resource on me right now, but the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, actually put together a resource of how parents can talk to their kids about the pandemic, how you can kind of help alleviate some of that anxiety. So I'm happy to try to search for that, send it along with the slides. And I think that's a really, really helpful resource as a parent to start kind of supporting their anxiety and helping their mental health through the pandemic specifically.
That would be great, Kelsey, if you could send that along.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll piggyback on top of that too, Kelsey, if you don't mind. I think in terms of COVID, in terms of anxieties, in terms of all of the things that students, but we're all struggling with right now, these are totally appropriate topics to be discussing with obviously your trusted adults, but with the counselors at school as well. I think if anybody sort of understands the consistent anxiety and difficulties that our students are undergoing, our counselors are seeing it day in and day out. So I think any chance that we can have to sort of have follow-up conversations to alleviate anxiety and provide whatever supports and resources we can, obviously we're here.
So another question came in and said, confidentiality for kids is so important, but if a child called the helpline, would parents be informed? So we don't necessarily inform parents because, first of all, we don't always know the age of someone when they call us. That's part of kind of the difficulty of being a helpline. So everyone is kind of risk assessed. If they get to a point where we're really worried about them, then we would start reaching out to support. We tend to ask them who their support person is, but we don't always have the information to follow up to that parent. So it's a little bit difficult for two reasons. One, we don't necessarily know the age, and two, we don't necessarily have the follow-up. I think that looks a little bit different in the school. So that's part of the reason we do these workshops as well. Most people that we work with, and I know you all at Blake Middle School use a specific risk assessment, but we always send one out if a school doesn't have one after the workshop, so we can kind of identify which students are struggling and get them connected to the guidance counselor, who then are kind of that middle ground, and then potentially we'll be reaching out to the parent, making sure that they're informed about what their kid is going through and supporting them.
That's actually a great segue, Kelsey, to something that I did want to talk about. A lot of parents very frequently, they're concerned, and rightfully so, that their students are going to be listening to this information. It might spark something in them. They want to have conversations, and how do they get connected to supports afterwards? We have actually we have a survey instrument. It's called the Brief Screen for Adolescent Depression. It's pretty easy to find online. It's a very quick, I believe it's just 7 questions that are meant to be sort of a barometer to assess for warning signs of depression. In that survey, it does ask very specific questions about suicidal ideation, but then it also does indicate whether or not this person has a trusted adult and whether or not that person feels comfortable speaking with somebody in school and outside of school. For the 7th grade, this is not an anonymous instrument. So we will have all of this information. So typically speaking, obviously, if a student indicates that they're struggling to a significant degree, those are conversations that we as counselors have immediately afterwards. The parents will be notified so that that student can get applicable resources immediately afterwards. And then also there's a section for these students that if they are struggling or if they're not, and they'd like to have conversations following the presentation, they can indicate that they want to have a follow-up conversation. And then within the next 24 hours, it might be a little bit longer just given the sort of hybrid nature of things right now, but within the next handful of days, that student will have a one-on-one conversation with myself, any number of the other counselors, so that again, we can address whatever questions, whatever issues come up. And obviously that goes not just for immediately after the presentation, but throughout the rest of the year and throughout their time here as well.
And I would just share, while the students are during the presentation, they're taking it in their advisories, and the advisors will be monitoring and keeping an eye on the students as well, and noticing for just keep an eye as best we can, and if anything kind of arises, or try to open up that conversation, making sure that they connect to the students, but also relay it on to Matt as guidance counselor, or Russ or Stephanie or any of us, just to make sure, just because we want to make sure we're monitoring and because it can bring up different things and we just don't know. So we want to make sure that we're watching that for each of the cohorts on the given days.
That's a good point. I usually start all presentations with this. I didn't today, but I do with young people just saying, if it does bring up anything, sometimes we don't know what it's going to bring up, that they're free to take a step outside, but that an adult is going to, check in on them, make sure that they're supported. And I know at Blake, it's always been great because there's multiple people in the room there to be that support system if they do need to take a step outside. So I like to lay that kind of culture out there for the workshop and remind them that there are support people in the room.
Any last questions about either the presentation this upcoming week, the survey, or anything that we've gone over here tonight?
Russ, can I just add one thing? So hi, everybody on the call. My name is Stephanie Worthley, and I'm the Director of Guidance for the district. And we've been doing this Signs of Suicide Samaritans program for a few years now. And if you're new to this program, if your 7th grader is your oldest, I just wanted to make mention that we actually do this program in 7th grade, 9th grade, and 12th grade. So we build upon this kind of every couple years. So it really becomes kind of a fabric of the programming that we do throughout middle school and high school. We've had a lot of, I'd say, success over the years, reaching out to kids and working with students through this program. So if you do have any questions about it, feel free to reach out to either myself or Matt, Nat, Russ. Any of us are more than happy to talk about it. As we've seen the data over the years, our students, especially between 8th grade, 9th grade, and 10th grade, that's when we tend to see a lot of spikes in the data as far as thoughts of suicide goes. So we want to get this information out to students in a timely manner, so that way they do know who their trusted adults are and who to contact and who to talk to should they be feeling this way. So we really appreciate your support tonight and for being here. And again, please reach out with questions should you have any.
All right. Well, if we've covered everything, Kelsey, as always, this was wonderful. Thank you so much. For those who are still here in attendance, if questions do come up, if you don't feel comfortable asking in this forum, as Stephanie said, please don't hesitate to reach out. If they're school-based, any of us would be more than happy to support you or answer any questions. And again, the Samaritans Hope line is right there. And you have Kelsey's information as well, should you have any specific questions for her. So thank you all again for your attendance. We really appreciate your time and your commitment to be a part of this conversation, albeit a difficult one, but it's really impactful and really important. So once again, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kelsey. Thanks, Russ.
Thank you.